Maybe we'll do it 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Who knows how many times? We might even have sex till the sun comes up. I invited Natalie to Michigan, and things are going good between us. Getting my Uncle Marco's blessing was a huge deal to me.
What is wrong with these people?
I mean, this should feel like progress. Real progress. The kind that proves all the old chaos, excuses, distance, and confusion are finally behind them, but the second the conversation shifts toward children and the future, the mood changes in a way that is hard to ignore, because now the relationship has to stop sounding good and start functioning, and that is where the weakness shows up almost immediately. That is the strange part with Gino, because he is always able to talk about what he wants in the biggest possible terms: commitment, family, a child of his own, a real future, the kind of life that sounds serious and grounded and emotionally mature, and if you only listen to the words, you might think this is a man who is finally ready to build something solid, but the minute the relationship moves from idea to reality, from long-term dream to present tense closeness, he starts to feel off again, hesitant again, weirdly disconnected again, like he loves the image of being chosen, more than the actual responsibility of knowing how to be close to the person choosing him. And that is why Natalie being back matters so much more than just a reunion beat, because her return removes a lot of the old excuses. She is here. She is trying. She is giving this another shot. She is not shutting him out. She is not playing impossible to reach. She is not rejecting the future talk. In fact, once the topic of children comes up through Uncle Marco, the path is almost laid out for Gino to step into the role he keeps describing. The man who wants love, stability, commitment, and eventually fatherhood, but instead of making the relationship feel stronger, that conversation puts pressure on the exact place where everything still feels shaky, because wanting a child is not just some emotional talking point. It is tied to intimacy, comfort, confidence, connection, and the ability to actually exist inside a romantic relationship without turning every physical moment into an awkward puzzle. That is what makes this feel less like a sweet second chance and more like a test that neither of them is fully naming yet. Is Natalie back because she truly sees growth in him, or because some part of her still needs to find out whether this relationship had real potential all along and just got lost in bad timing, bad communication, an emotional mess, and on the other side is Gino actually ready for the life he keeps describing, or is he still more attached to the identity of being a husband and father than the daily intimacy required to get there? Because those are not the same thing. Plenty of people want the symbol. Far fewer know how to carry the reality. What makes it even more uneasy is that Natalie does not seem closed off here. If anything, she seems more open than the moment deserves. She is present, emotionally available, and willing to move the relationship into a more real space, which should be the easiest possible lane for Gino if all his talk has substance behind it. But instead, there is that same familiar friction, that same sense that emotional access does not automatically become physical ease with him. And once that happens, every hopeful part of the reunion starts to feel less secure. The exclusivity sounds good, but is it actually growth, or is it just a cleaner label placed over the same old dysfunction? The child conversation sounds serious, but is it real planning, or future talk covering present weakness? Natalie seems patient, but is she truly settling in, or quietly watching, quietly measuring, quietly deciding whether this second chance has anything different underneath it? And that is where the whole thing gets almost absurd, because the more Gino talks about the future, the more obvious it becomes that the present still does not move naturally. Natalie can signal closeness, she can open the door, she can make it easier than this, and yet Gino still reacts like intimacy is the most difficult part of the entire relationship, which leaves the hardest question hanging over everything from the very start. If Natalie is back, if she is open, if this is supposed to be the healthier version of them, then why does Gino still look like the relationship becomes scary the second it stops being a dream and starts becoming real? The easy version of this story is to laugh it off and say Gino is just awkward, Natalie is just being patient, and this whole thing is another slightly weird reunion between two people who cannot quite get their timing right, but that reading is probably too simple, and honestly too forgiving, because the minute you slow down and look at what is actually happening here, the whole relationship starts to feel less like a sweet second chance and more like a live test of whether either of them truly believes this can work in the real world, not in memory, not in theory, not in some abstract future where all the missing pieces magically fix themselves, but right now, in person, under pressure, with expectations getting more serious by the minute. That is why the conversation around children matters so much more than it first appears to, because on the surface, it sounds like a normal family milestone topic, one of those classic relationship moments where an older relative brings up the future and the couple smiles through it like they are stepping into something more serious. But in this case, it does something much sharper than that, because it quietly exposes the central contradiction in Gino's whole posture. He keeps reaching for the biggest possible outcomes. He wants exclusivity. He wants commitment. He wants a child. He wants to be seen as someone building a future. But wanting those things in words is not the same as being ready for the emotional and physical reality that leads to them, and that gap is starting to feel less like temporary nervousness and more like the same old block wearing a cleaner shirt. And that is where Natalie becomes harder to read in a way that actually makes the story better, because she is not just some passive woman standing there waiting for Gino to figure himself out. Her return could mean a lot of things at once, and that ambiguity matters. Maybe she does still care about him and wants to believe there is something worth saving here. Maybe she is lonely. Maybe she is drawn to the familiarity of an old connection that still feels unresolved. Maybe part of her genuinely hopes he has changed. But it is also possible that her return is not pure faith at all. It could be part hope and part investigation, part emotional pull and part quiet evaluation, like she needs to see with her own eyes whether this man is actually different now, or whether the same frustrating pattern is still sitting underneath all the nicer language and more serious talk. That is what makes the Uncle Marco moment so revealing, because family framing can sometimes make a relationship feel more official, more grounded, more real, but it can also apply pressure before the foundation is ready to hold it. Once the child idea is placed on the table, this stops being just a reunion with romantic potential and starts becoming a question of readiness, not sincerity, readiness. Those are not the same thing, and people confuse them all the time because humans adore rewarding intention even when intention keeps crashing into the same wall. Gino may be sincere. He may absolutely mean it when he talks about wanting a family. But sincerity does not automatically equal capacity. It does not prove he knows how to create closeness, sustain intimacy, or move naturally inside a relationship once it stops being about longing and starts being about mutual comfort. And that is where the pressure test becomes impossible to ignore, because intimacy is not some side issue floating off to the edge of the story while the real plot is about children and commitment. It is the bridge. It is the missing bridge between everything Gino says he wants and the actual reality of whether he can build it. If that bridge is weak, then every larger promise starts looking shaky too. The child conversation stops sounding sweet and starts sounding premature. The exclusivity label stops sounding reassuring and starts sounding like a cover for unresolved dysfunction. Even Natalie's openness starts to change shape, because instead of looking like the beginning of a healthy rhythm, it starts looking like she is giving him every possible chance to meet her halfway and quietly noticing that he still cannot do it without strain. That is the part that should make viewers uneasy, because once you entertain the possibility that the same flaw from Gino's past is still running this relationship, the whole reunion stops looking simple. Maybe he is nervous because he cares. Maybe. But maybe he is nervous because emotional closeness still activates the exact same discomfort that has always made him stumble when the relationship gets real. Maybe Natalie is back because she believes in him. Maybe. But maybe she is back to find out whether there is anything left beyond memory, hope, and repetition. And if that is true, then this second chance is not standing on solid ground at all. It is standing on a question neither of them has fully answered yet, which is far more dangerous than open conflict, because doubt this quiet can sit inside a relationship for a while before it finally decides to break it. By this point, the story stops being something viewers can watch in one clean way, because now it turns into an argument, not just between the people on screen, but inside the audience watching them, since one group is going to look at Gino and see a man who really is trying, a man who clearly wants the relationship, wants the future, wants the stability, and maybe just happens to be painfully awkward, emotionally slow, and embarrassingly bad at handling physical closeness in a natural way, while another group is going to look at that exact same behavior and see something much less innocent, something more familiar, more frustrating, and maybe more revealing. Because when the opportunity is right in front of him, and Natalie is not being distant, cold, or confusing, and he still cannot meet the moment cleanly, then people start asking a harsher question, not whether he wants intimacy, but whether he is actually capable of functioning inside the kind of adult relationship he keeps talking about like it is right around the corner. That is where the whole thing gets volatile, because once Natalie makes it clear that she is open to closeness, there is nowhere left to hide behind excuses. It is not about bad timing now. It is not about being separated. It is not about mixed signals or some huge, unresolved fight poisoning the mood. She is there, she is willing, and she is not exactly speaking in riddles, so when Gino still responds with that same hesitant, delayed, almost disconnected energy, the meaning of it becomes the real story. Is this just innocence and nerves, the behavior of someone who feels pressure and freezes because he cares too much, or is this immaturity, fear, low confidence, or even something deeper that keeps sabotaging him every time a relationship asks him to be fully present in both emotional and physical terms? And the reason viewers split so hard on this kind of scene is because both readings have enough truth inside them to survive for a while. Gino does not look cruel here. He does not look manipulative in some obvious cartoonish way. He looks off. He looks delayed. He looks like someone whose idea of desire may depend on it arriving in the safest possible conditions, slowly enough that he never has to risk embarrassment, never has to move decisively, never has to lead with any confidence that could actually be rejected. But Natalie may not experience his hesitation in that soft, charitable way at all. She may read the exact same pause as emotional distance, lack of attraction, or lack of masculine certainty. That is the trap. Two people can stand in the same moment and still be translating it through completely different emotional filters, and once that starts happening, frustration does not need some huge betrayal to grow. It grows because each repeated missed moment starts to mean something different to each person involved. That is why this stops being about one awkward scene and starts becoming a referendum on the relationship itself. Because if Gino keeps talking in these huge future terms, exclusivity, commitment, children, building a life, and then keeps stumbling the second the relationship asks him to show up in the present, viewers are going to ask whether the future talk is actually helping or making things worse. At some point, talking about tomorrow while fumbling today stops sounding romantic and starts sounding unstable. It creates a weird split inside the relationship where the label says serious, the dream says serious, the family framing says serious, but the actual chemistry still feels like it is trying to learn how to walk in public without tripping over itself. That is not just awkward. That is dangerous. Because the more serious the label becomes, the more every small failure starts carrying more emotional weight than it should. And Natalie becomes part of that debate too, because her patience can also be read in two very different ways. One reading is generous. She is trying to give the relationship space, trying not to punish him for nervousness, trying to build something carefully instead of forcing it into some fake passionate script. But another reading is much darker and maybe more realistic, because she may not be patiently building at all. She may be slowly walking herself back into the exact same dynamic that never really worked before, hoping that sincerity will somehow produce a different result this time. That is the uncomfortable possibility sitting under everything here. Not that either of them is evil, not that one scene decides the whole relationship, but that repetition may already be happening while both of them are still calling it progress. And that is where viewers start making their own judgment, because once the same kind of hesitation keeps showing up, people stop debating mood and start debating structure. Is this temporary or structural? Is this just a rough patch and a second chance? Or are we watching the same incompatibility return in softer clothes? Is exclusivity helping them build something, or is it trapping them in a level of seriousness they have not actually earned yet? More importantly, if the awkwardness keeps going, who loses faith first? Does Natalie eventually stop reading this as nerves and start reading it as rejection? Or does Gino feel so exposed by the pressure to perform like a full partner that he retreats even further into talk about the future instead of dealing with the present? Because once doubt gets inside a second chance relationship, it does not stay small for long, and every missed moment after that stops feeling random and starts feeling like evidence. By now, the awkwardness stops being something you can brush off with a nervous laugh. Because once a relationship starts repeating the same weak point over and over, that weak point stops being a funny little quirk and starts becoming the thing that drains the entire bond from the inside out. And that is exactly where Gino and Natalie start to feel more fragile than hopeful, because Natalie has already done the part that is usually supposed to unlock progress. She came back. She gave him access. She gave him time. She gave him openness. She gave him exclusivity. And if all of that still keeps producing hesitation, uncertainty, and a strange inability to move naturally toward closeness, then her patience no longer looks sweet. It starts looking expensive, emotionally expensive, because the longer one person keeps offering the relationship a real chance while the other keeps returning mixed signals, the more that patience turns into quiet wear and tear. That is the danger here, and it is bigger than one uncomfortable moment, because the unresolved issue is no longer sitting in a corner by itself. It is now touching everything Gino says he wants. Children depend on intimacy. Commitment depends on trust. Exclusivity depends on the belief that the bond is actually growing. Long-term plans depend on whether the relationship can function in ordinary real life, not just in emotional speeches about the future. If that foundation stays weak, then every big dream Gino names starts to feel less like vision and more like overreach. And at some point, even the child conversation, which might sound heartfelt on the surface, starts feeling almost reckless, because talking about building a family while the present relationship still struggles with basic ease is not romantic. It is a sign that the emotional timeline is running ahead of the actual relationship. And that is where the pressure becomes real for Natalie in a way that is easy to miss if you only look at the surface. She does not need to hate Gino for this to become a turning point. She does not need some huge betrayal, some explosive fight, or some dramatic confession. Sometimes people do not pull away because they stop caring. Sometimes they pull away because they finally get tired of standing in the same uncertainty while the other person keeps calling it progress. That is what makes this feel heavy. Natalie may not be reaching some loud breaking point. She may simply be seeing the pattern more clearly than Gino does, which is in some ways even worse, because once one person starts recognizing that the issue is not bad timing, not bad luck, not one awkward night, but an actual mismatch in how the relationship functions, it becomes hard to unsee it. That is also where the power dynamic quietly changes, and this shift matters a lot. Earlier, Gino's whole mission was getting another chance, winning her back, proving that the relationship was not dead, but once Natalie actually gives him that chance, the story changes, because now the question is not whether he can get the relationship, it is whether he can keep it, and those are two completely different things. Chasing a second chance lets him operate in longing, in hope, in future talk, in the emotional safety of wanting. Keeping that second chance forces him into performance, not fake performance, but real relational performance, meaning he has to show that he can actually sustain closeness, respond naturally, and give Natalie something solid enough that she does not start feeling like she is carrying the whole emotional weight of the reunion by herself. If he cannot do that, then the very thing he fought to get starts sliding back out of his hands. That is why Natalie's effort starts to feel less like romance and more like a final test. Every bit of openness she offers now carries a hidden question. Is this going anywhere real, or am I just giving more to a pattern that cannot change? Is Gino talking about family because he truly understands what that requires, or because the idea of family is easier for him to love than the vulnerable, present, sometimes awkward reality of building one? Their exclusivity does prove something, but only intention. It does not prove compatibility. It does not prove rhythm. It does not prove that the emotional and physical sides of this relationship can actually line up in a way that lasts. And once you see the story that way, the whole thing starts to feel like a countdown, not to some breakthrough romantic payoff, but to the point where Natalie may decide that wanting is not enough, sincerity is not enough, and future talk is definitely not enough if the relationship itself still feels underdeveloped right where it matters most. Because that is the hard truth pressing on everything now. Gino's issue does not look like bad timing anymore. Natalie's willingness does not look like a guaranteed fix. The child dream still carries emotional power, but it is hanging in the air without real support underneath it. So the question changes. It is no longer whether Gino wants this badly enough. The question is whether wanting it matters if every sign suggests he still may not know how to sustain the relationship once it becomes real. So when you strip away the easy jokes, the awkward pauses, the false comfort of calling this progress just because it looks calmer than the disasters around it, the answer becomes a lot clearer and a lot harsher, because Gino and Natalie probably do have something real between them, some actual connection, some emotional pull that keeps bringing them back into each other's orbit, even after enough frustration to make most people walk away for good. But having something real is not the same as having something stable, and that is the distinction this whole storyline keeps forcing into view. Because Gino does not come off like a man who is faking his feelings, he does not feel empty, cold, or purely performative here. He feels sincere in a way that is actually more frustrating, because sincere people are harder to dismiss, and yet sincerity still does not solve the problem in front of him. Since wanting the future with Natalie, talking about exclusivity, talking about family, talking about children, and sounding emotionally invested in a long-term life does not automatically mean he knows how to build the basic closeness that makes those things real. That is why Natalie's second chance matters so much, because it removes the excuses that used to protect this relationship from full judgment. She is there. She is present. She is engaged. She is not emotionally absent, not keeping him at arm's length, not trapped behind distance, not hiding behind confusion, and not refusing the seriousness of where this could go. Which means, if the relationship still feels stalled now, then the problem cannot just be timing, access, or labels anymore. The problem is deeper than that. The problem is in the structure of the bond itself. It is in the way the relationship still seems to struggle right at the point where future plans are supposed to become lived intimacy. And that is the hardest truth in the whole story, because once that becomes obvious, a lot of the hopeful language around them starts collapsing under its own weight. And that is the irony carrying everything here. Because Gino may genuinely have the healthiest relationship in the room compared with all the louder chaos surrounding him, but stability, by comparison, is not the same thing as actual readiness for love, intimacy, and family. Looking calmer than everybody else is not proof that your relationship is strong. Sometimes it just means your dysfunction is quieter, less theatrical, and easier to misread as maturity. In fact, that may be what makes this more revealing than the messier couples. There is no giant blow-up here distracting from the real issue. There is no screaming match big enough to turn the whole audience into referees. Instead, there is something more subtle and in some ways more damaging. The slow exposure of a bond that keeps reaching for milestones before it proves it can handle closeness. That may be Gino's real issue in the end. Not lack of desire, not total lack of care, but a deeper habit of chasing outcomes, because outcomes feel safer than vulnerability. It is easier to talk about exclusivity than to live comfortably inside intimacy. It is easier to talk about children than to deal with the awkward, exposed, ordinary reality of being close to the person you claim to want a future with. It is easier to name the destination than to master the steps required to get there. And Natalie becomes the mirror for that problem, whether she means to or not, because her presence forces the gap into the open. She is the proof that the old obstacles are not enough to explain what is still not working. So the central question does get answered, and the answer is not dramatic in the flashy way reality TV usually likes, but it is heavier than that. The relationship still feels stalled, because the real problem was never just getting Natalie back, never just becoming exclusive, never just restoring access to each other. The real problem is that the bond itself still seems weak at the exact place where future talk has to become lived connection. If that emotional and physical mismatch stays unresolved, then every dream Gino names is going to keep sounding larger than the relationship carrying it. If Natalie loses patience, this second chance will not just be another failed attempt. It may become the clearest proof that nothing fundamental actually changed. And if Gino cannot connect action to desire, then every promise he makes about the future will keep feeling one step ahead of the reality beneath it. That is what makes this storyline more interesting than it first looks, because the real takeaway is not just whether Gino and Natalie are together right now, or whether this second chance survives another week. The real takeaway is bigger and uglier and more honest than that. A couple can look quieter, calmer, and less chaotic than everyone else in the room and still be standing on weak ground, And sometimes the relationship with the fewest screaming matches is the one asking the most dangerous question of all, which is what happens when two people want the future, badly enough to talk about it, but still cannot fully meet each other in the present.